So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, the OBBB, or One Big Beautiful Bill, is now law in the United States. And that law eliminates the 30% tax credit for residential solar. It also adds some restrictions to the 30% tax credit for commercial solar. And it's important to make a distinction that for solar leases and power purchase agreements, those are considered commercial installations. So there are still tax credits under the lease and the PPA structures. So effectively, the price for cash and loan purchases, which is the residential tax credit, those costs are going to go up 30% as of January 1st, 2026. No more 30% tax credit. Solar leasing, there'll still be incentives, but there's going to be increasing leasing prices. And then the other thing is for the leasing and the power purchase agreements, which many companies are selling, it's also called third-party ownership structures. There are domestic content rules, there's safe harbor considerations, and there are foreign entity of concern issues, FEOCs, which complicate product availability and pricing. We're not going to dive into that in too much detail because we're going to mostly focus on the residential credit. But as a result of these changes, every single solar contractor is working like crazy to get systems installed by the end of 2025. 2025 is going to be a record year for solar and battery installations. 2026, not so good. So smart companies are planning now for 2026. And that raises two questions. First, what should solar contractors and installers do to succeed in 2026 and beyond? And second, what should solar and battery customers consider when evaluating products and installers for this year and next year? So I'm really happy to have this week's guest, Brian Ghiglia. He's the Vice President of Sales for REC Americas. Brian heads up REC's residential sales efforts. And because of the output and efficiency of REC modules, they've been our best sellers this year. Now, I didn't realize, but prior to REC, Brian was with Sunrun for 11 years. And I was doing installations in California, as was he. Back in 2008, he was a residential sales consultant. So he understands firsthand the issues of sitting down at a customer's dining room table to talk about solar and batteries, plus the perspective of a large module manufacturer. So welcome to the show, Brian.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me, Barry.
All right. It's really an honor to have you here on the Energy Show. And I think it would be great if you could tell us a bit more about REC's current line of products.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're focused on the residential segment. And so the leading product right now is our Alpha Pure RX. It's a 460 watt module. It's made with heterojunction technology. So it has the best power output in the industry, along with the highest efficiency in the industry. We'll get into why that matters, but high level, you're going to get the most kilowatt hours out of your roof. In California in particular, as solar penetration grows, as batteries become a requirement, getting the most out of your roof is paramount. And so that's really what REC Group focuses on, is the technology of the cell structure itself. And then, focusing on the long-term yield of the technology. A couple of our legacy products that we still have in the market are on the same heterojunction platform, just a slightly different cell size. So Pure 2 420 watt modules, and there's still some Pure 400 watt modules out there as well. So everything we've done over the last 6 years has been based off of heterojunction technology. We believe that's the most advantaged cell technology, and particularly for the residential space, best equipped to make the best use of limited roof spaces.
So we have a lot of technical people that are listening into the podcast for years. Could you define what heterojunction means?
Yeah, heterojunction is really a combination of two technology platforms. The first is a silicon-based traditional cell, and then we sandwich that on top and bottom with amorphous silicon. So starting with the crystalline silicon, we're using an N-type cell, which means it's negatively doped. That gives us better thermal performance and better degradation characteristics over time. The amorphous silicon kind of kicks that up to another level rather. So that will give us better extended performance. We degrade at 0.25%, actually 0.24% annually. So you're going to get a 92% output guarantee over 25 years. And then secondarily, amorphous silicon opens up to a broader spectrum of light. And so panels turn on a little bit earlier, turn off a little bit later. It's the age old, SunPower used to talk about that quite a bit. Same basic concept, although, the heterojunction platform is a lower cost stack overall to manufacture. And so I joined REC Group in 19 when we were pivoting into this technology. We decided not to commercialize N-type, but rather heterojunction. And the primary reason being we could scale more effectively and we can get our cost roadmap down more effectively with heterojunction. So, for the past 6 years, we've been manufacturing out of Singapore on this platform. And now with our parent company, we're expanding and really increasing our size by 3 or 4x with our new factory coming online in India.
Tell us a little bit about your parent company.
Yeah, so Reliance Industries is a Fortune 50 global company. They acquired us in 2003, I believe is when we actually closed with diligence period in 2002. We're really fortunate to have them as parent company. They are traditionally, they have 5 business units. They have internet, telecom, retail, and then petrochemicals. The last vertical is new energies. And so they're really pivoting their business away from oil and gas into renewable energies. And we're kind of the tip of the spear. So they acquired us to be kind of the technology lead for their investment into renewable energies, and couldn't be happier with them as a parent. They bought our brand and our technology because they too believed that heterojunction was the winning technological platform to scale into both residential, commercial, and industrial. And then they've really been hands off. It's been great. They let us run our business, and it's a tumultuous time globally, certainly across all markets. And then in the US, we are a bit more protected than in other parts of the market. So we've invested and continue to grow here in the US.
Well, I don't exactly know what you mean by protection. We'll leave that aside for now. But it's amusing to me, the whole transitions of REC, because REC, I recall back in like the early 2000s, was Renewable Energy Concepts, which was a San Luis Obispo installer. And then they somehow combined with REC Silicon, and then they kind of got spun off again, and now it's in India. So it's very interesting how the REC acronym has been passed around for years. And this is the first time that I'm really jumping behind it. I mean, the last few years, it's by far and away the best product on the roof, and it's in the highest demand, and it works really well.
Yeah. I mean, I've lived it, and it's not easy to explain. But REC, the company you mentioned, was an EPC company started by 2 Cal Poly grads, Fred and Judy Sisson, good friends, worked with them closely. REC Group invested in REC Solar. REC Group is a Norwegian company where they originally founded. And so that was the original partnership, was REC Group and REC Solar, 2 totally different companies. I worked for both of them, and now I'm with the manufacturer. We actually have a white paper on this because it gets sorted and confusing, but the high level is today REC Group, headquartered in Singapore, offices globally, and focusing on the US market.
What's amazing to me is the first time I remember a trademark infringement issue resulting in a happy merger between 2 companies. So that's really good. All right. While we're talking about acronyms, what are G12 wafers?
Yeah. So that's a measurement for wafers, right? So I don't know why they choose these sizes. I probably should, but there's M10, M11, and then they go to Gs, and there's G12s and G12Rs. So we standardized on G12 when we made the pivot into heterojunction technology. Actually, I take that back. We began with an M6 wafer that was 166 millimeters, and now the G12s are 210 millimeters. So the product I mentioned at the top, Alpha Pure RX, is a 44 cell half cut design. So there's actually 88 cells. Each one of those is 210 millimeters wide. And so that's where the G12 comes from. So why would you select G12 versus M10 or M11 or G12R? Again, all this is with an eye towards efficiency and cost. So when we look at the global markets upstream, we saw a cost roadmap over a 2 to 5 year horizon that told us a couple things. First of all, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, N-type cells were becoming more scarce over the next 2 to 3 years, so their costs were going up. That's why we started to move towards heterojunction. And then secondly, when you look at the availability of cells, the smaller cells were becoming more scarce, whereas larger scales became more what the industry was standardizing on in the utility segment. Wafer sizes are dictated by the utility segment, broadly speaking, and in order to drive economies of scale, typically larger is better. The last point specific to our technology is G12 was something where we could actually get thinner wafers. And thinner wafers, again, allows us to draw out more costs, and it allows us to drive more efficiency into the cell. So we're talking about microns here in terms of thin, or the thickness of the wafer, and tenths of percentages on the overall cell design. But when you package that all up and put it into a facility that produces gigawatts of cells and modules, it really translates to a competitive advantage over the long term.
So when I measured things, the G12 wafers are about 8 inches in diameter. So I'm guessing you're pulling an 8-inch ingot and then you're slicing it and you're getting square pieces. And then what's the purpose of the half cells? Explain that to us.
So when you're designing a solar module, you're always trying to maximize the power. And there's two ways to do that, with voltage or with amperage. And so the amperage of a module is driven by the surface area of when you have a 210 millimeter cell that's square, and sorry, I speak in millimeters because we do that globally, but it's about 8 inches. That is a very high current that is produced. And that can work quite well in the utility segment. And indeed, in the utility segment, we tend to use non-half cut cells. But when we look at different segments that we're working in, we wanted to try and balance the current versus the voltage. And so by going to a half cut architecture, we reduced the overall amperage that the module produces. And in turn, you double the voltage of the module. So it's kind of a trade-off. And this is something as a technology leader that we always have to balance, is driving the most power output. That means that you're operating on the margins of what is acceptable in terms of voltage and amperage. We decided to go with a higher voltage, both from safety concerns and from market acceptance terms. And so as a result, when you work with power electronics on our modules, we have to always make sure that we're within the voltage characteristic or profile of whatever power electronic we're working with. Luckily, we've kind of managed to design it to reach the peaks of those profiles. And that, again, is designed specifically so that we can optimize the number of kilowatt hours that the system's going to produce throughout the day, year, etc.
And then so the electronics that you're talking about, and we're kind of experienced with that because we're always trying to match our power electronics with modules, is you've got module interconnects. Tesla uses that. Some other companies are using that. Franklin's going to use that. You've got optimizers, which many companies use, and you've got microinverters, and they all have limits to current and voltage and wattage. So the 460 modules are basically working out right. I have a couple more geeky questions.
Let's do it.
How do you slice those wafers into half-cut cells? Are there robots with very sharp razor blades? And that's one. Second, how do you do all the extra soldering steps? Because you need twice as many soldering steps if you're using half-cut wafers.
So the second point is really important. I want to get to that, and I should have mentioned it at the top. So with regard to how they're half cut, this is, again, a technology that REC pioneered. So we have the patent on how to half cut cells. This was done, I believe it was back in 13, maybe 12. I'll have to go back and check. At the time, people thought we were crazy because the most expensive part of the manufacturing process is the cell itself. And to cut a cell in half risks a lot of breakage, and that's just going to explode your costs. We demonstrated that indeed you can do that effectively, and then that unlocks, kind of the benefits that you receive around voltage and amperage that you can begin to play with. The way that it's done is trade secret, but I can tell you I was in our factory in Singapore in January. I go back once a year, and it's all a highly automated process. There aren't robots with like knives, but there are robots with lasers that are doing this.
Yeah, you got jetties with lightsabers. Zoom, 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 zoom.
And it's really something to behold. The first time I went to the factory, actually, it was crazy. We have robots that are piloted by AI, or they're engineered with AI, so they're all going along on their own course, taking different components to different places and then setting them up into the cell line where you actually see them go through the process. And I actually got in one's way. I had to stop and go around me. It definitely feels like the future. So the half cut process, again, is done with basically laser cuts. And then with regard to your second point, in a traditional module, like an N-type module, you would double up the number of soldering points, but we use...
Yeah, so let me interrupt you on that before we go. Remember, the way these solderings were done is there was just long lines of ladies with soldering irons and white hats, and they'd sit there and zzz, 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 completely unsustainable as you go to like half cut cells. So you've got a better way. What is it?
We have a better way because we're not doing any soldering. And so part of heterojunction technology is using hair thin wires, right? So we actually embed those wires with the amorphous silicon onto the cell. And one of the advantages you get with heterojunction technology is, A, you don't have to do as much soldering, which means there's not as much thermal stress on the cell. When you solder, you're getting up to about 600 degrees Celsius at specific contact points. When you use heterojunction technology, we're basically creating that sandwich, right, with the silicon cell and then the wires that go in between the cell and the amorphous silicon. And then we heat that up to about 200 degrees Celsius. So the TCO layer, which is basically a polymer, rests on top and adheres to the cell itself. And then those cells actually have 3 or 4 times as many contact points because it was all kind of adhered at the same time rather than one specific solder. And that again increases yield. So our X module, I believe we're up to 16. You would think of them as bus bars, but they're really just hair thin wires that don't have any soldering involved whatsoever.
That's very, very cool. Learn more about the heterojunction process. I'll have to take a magnifying glass and take a look at that 460 and see if I can see all these little things. Okay.
The cool thing about it is it's not new technology. It's just we figured out how to kind of perfect it. Back in 2008, 2009, Sanyo was doing this. And I remember seeing those bifacial Sanyo modules. They were very, very cool. We've taken it to the next step.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. So let's get out of the technology geekdom and talk about what the OBBB means for rooftop solar and batteries. How do you think that bill is going to affect things? We know what's happening in 2025. How's it going to affect it in the coming years, 2026 and beyond?
Yeah, we have a joke going around internally that our crystal ball fell off the table years ago. And so we're done trying to prognosticate and forecast. But certainly this is, in the short term, bad, right? Well, in the very short term, it's good for residential, right? This is going to be one of the biggest years ever. We have the biggest call to action of all time in that the 30% tax credit is going away at the end of the year. When we talk specifically about residential, the next, call it 12, 18, maybe 24 months are going to be down relative to prior years. You've been doing this for 20 plus years. We really haven't had year over year declines during that period. So this is going to be one of the first times where we take a little bit of a step back. However, I'm an eternal optimist, and I do actually believe this is going to create a more durable residential segment in that, the OB3, as I call it, it's going to increase retail costs of power, right? They've taken off one of the most readily deployable assets to the grid at large in short term, and that's renewable energies, or they made it more difficult for renewable energy to be deployed. And that's going to have the midterm effect of increasing utility rates more quickly than they already were increasing. And so when we look at the modeling of how the residential solar segment can perform without incentives, even today in California and the Northeast, you still have an attractive return on investment. You can still get a better than 10-year payback, which is what we were selling in 2008 and 2009. So that is already a proven model. When we look out into 27, 28, 29, utility rates more broadly in the other 30 some odd states that don't have high solar penetration, they're going to reach that level where the break-even point unlocks a more addressable market. And so in the medium term, I do see the residential segment returning to where it was, let's say 22, 23. And then thereafter, it will continue to be durable because it won't have any incentives or won't be reliant on incentives. In the C&I and the utility segments, we just had the executive order that was released last week. By and large, it was not as bad as we thought, right? Yeah. And so a lot of the safe harbor cycles have been preserved. You can still do some of the performance tests or continuity tests to achieve safe harbor. And so that's going to allow a lot of those utility projects to continue. Whereas before we saw it taking quite a big step back, we don't actually see as much risk against that. So I think long term, we will be on our upward trajectory with a traditional compounded growth rate that's similar to what we've seen in years past, call it 4, 5, 6%. The next 2 or 3 years are going to be a little bit slower.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's going to be rough next year. And then as electric rates continue to go up here in PG&E territory, they're already going up. The benefits are going to continue. We'll get back to good paybacks, 7, 8 years. And then long term, there's no doubt the cheapest way to make electricity is with solar panels, and battery pricing comes down. The package system cost is going to come down. We'll do really, really well over the next 3 or 4 years. All right. So we're talking about all these changes. Any insights into equipment pricing in 2026? Installers are kind of wondering, and customers are kind of wondering, like, what's going to happen in 2026 when this big peak of demand goes away?
There's a couple of variables that go into this. Obviously, there's the cost side of the equation, and then there's the standard supply demand side of the equation. Interestingly, being on the manufacturer side, solar doesn't follow traditional economic laws and it's kind of decoupled from a cost stack plus margin, right? Demand really dictates what costs will do, kind of irrespective of what the cost side of the equation looks like. But I think it still is something we have to consider is what's happening with tariffs and what's happening with supply. So I will answer your question succinctly, but I wanted to at least paint those pictures. So on the cost side, obviously there's a lot of talk about tariffs. There's a couple of categories of tariffs. There's the IEEPA tariffs, which seem to be coming into focus now. Most countries have between 10 and 30, some of them north of 50%, and those are still being negotiated with free trade deals. The second component is called anti-dumping countervailing duties. We're now on our fourth case that was recently submitted, picked up, I believe, in July. And so those are actually much more punitive. You've seen the same type of a case in the battery segment as well. Those could be as high as 100 or 200%. And so those two variables are going to have an inflationary effect on overall costs. On the supply side, the real trillion-dollar question is what's going to happen with FIOC and how is that going to affect overall supply. Let's assume that FIOC limits supply and that the tariffs are not as punitive as we had hoped. I see a landscape where pricing will hold. It could even decrease slightly. And the reason is there is a third category of tariffs, which is called 201. And that tariff is set to sunset at the end of January. And so that's a broad category of tariffs where all solar modules pay them, unless you had a country-specific exclusion. There's only a couple of those. So that's one element that strips out some cost. If on balance, supply and demand still matches up, I do see a bit of cost reduction on the horizon. And then there's obviously the ongoing cost roadmaps that all manufacturers are pursuing to lower costs. I don't think we're going to get to a place where we can strip out 30% costs like that. I'm not here to say that, but I do see costs stabilizing and potentially coming down in the first half of next year.
I totally agree. And I think from a distribution standpoint, everybody wants to make sure there's plenty of product in the distribution channel for fourth quarter of 2025. And then in the first quarter of 2026, there may be some effort to move inventory that's coming over on ships. So my guess is it'll be pricing of equipment is going to come down a little bit next year, but then it's going to stabilize. And then you got all the external factors that you talked about.
The other dynamic that you have to consider is, are we talking about domestic content or non-domestic content, right? Domestic content is going to be in high demand, and I would actually see that maintaining and potentially becoming more expensive if you can get it. There's going to be an undersupply of domestic content. So you really have to categorize it in domestic, non-domestic. Non-domestic is flat, maybe a little down. Domestic, flat, potentially a little bit up.
With all that great industry and technical product background out of the way, let's dive back into the two questions. So first, what should solar contractors be doing now to prepare to succeed in 2026 and beyond?
Specifically in the residential segment, I think we've got to get back to basics. There's been a lot of talk about this. I think everybody is right now heads down focusing on closing out 2025 as they should. But as you look forward to 2026 and we think about areas to reduce costs, obviously there's components, but components aren't going to strip out 30%. When you look at the fundamentals of your business, the most leveraged point for you to reduce costs is typically through sales and install process. And so the area that I always focus on is acquisition costs. That's where you're most leveraged in terms of if you can increase your overall acquisition percentages, meaning your close rates, that's going to reduce your acquisition costs dramatically. A lot of times, you can strip out 10, 15, 25 cents if you can diversify your lead sources and or become more efficient at the point of sale. And then similarly, throughput, right? If you have a cancellation rate that's, above 30%, and there's a lot of companies that do, you've got to get that down underneath 20, 15, or even 10%. So from a benchmarking perspective, I think we're going to have to get our acquisition costs into the 20-cent zone and hopefully lower. I think the best in class are below that. You've got to get your realization rates or your cancellation rates down below 20 and 15% in order to be able to overcome some of the, cost dynamics that are happening with the incentive going away. The second component is diversifying your business, right? And starting to look into C&I or other segments. I know a lot of companies are looking at HVAC and roofing. And so those are kind of the other categories that I would say to supplement what would otherwise be
Yeah.
some lost revenue.
Yep. And just as, my advice to companies is look at those close rates and, make sure that you're encouraging salespeople that have the highest close rate. In other words, if they get a lead or a qualified opportunity, who's got the best chance of closing that? Second, look at the operations and figure out how you can streamline that entire process. And the last one, which is kind of subtle, but not really that clear to a lot of people, is work with a good distributor that can simplify your logistics. And that's helped us tremendously. So, as far as diversifying, yes, I mean, we long ago decided that any service that we could deliver through a high voltage, high current wire, like in addition to solar batteries, it's EV chargers, heat pumps, panel upgrades. So we're able to do all that. And that helps reduce the customer acquisition cost because we have a happy solar customer. They're more likely to get an EV charger and a heat pump from us. And that works. A lot of work. And roofing is basically the same issue. It's not, you can't snap your fingers and get into those new businesses, but it does really give you a lot of diversification capability.
Two other points. I just would double down on your distribution comment. We've seen the industry really pivot over the last, say, 6 or 7 years, but probably broadly speaking, 10 years to an asset light model, right? Where you're not paying for warehouses and you're leveraging distribution networks, which are experts in this space. So I would definitely lean into that. And then kind of the second one, which we don't have a clear picture on, but this AI revolution is coincidental with us trying to strip out some costs. And I think there's going to be some real magic in figuring out a way to leverage AI into your business, specifically at lead generation, but then also throughout the entire sales funnel. I don't know much about AI. I'm officially in my 40s and I'm an old, awkward dad with teenagers. So I've got to learn this myself, but I do think that there is some magic there that the industry can take advantage of over the next 2 years.
Yeah, I could barely spell AI, but I do know that teams in different departments are starting to use it, and they explain it to me, and I'd say that's very cool as long as it's improving our efficiency. I'm happy. Okay, we talked a lot about contractors and installers. Let's put on our customer hat. What should solar and battery customers be thinking about when evaluating getting solar or batteries from an installer or a contractor, both right now and going forward in 2026 and beyond?
Yeah, that's an important question. First off, these are long-term investments. And so I always advocate that consumer needs to understand both the installer and the equipment, the companies that are behind those, to make sure that they're going to be around for the long term. And getting underneath that, as you peel that onion back, like what are the practices and supply chains of those companies? The battery side, there's a lot of risk right now, mainly around some of the AD/CVD risks, but also, and solar is not any different, a lot of it is tied to China. And so what is the company's longer term strategy to be able to meet US requirements to maintain access? Because the US has begun to draw some pretty bright lines around foreign entities of concern, but what can and cannot be imported. So understanding supply chain is important. And I have been speaking more openly about, having a bit of a, I guess, humanitarian approach to supply chain as well. So understanding, what is the labor that goes into those supply chains is important. I think consumers are not quite aware as I would like around some of the darker elements of our industry. I often make the connection to some of the textile industries in the 90s. We didn't realize sweatshop labor was being used. As soon as that became more broadly known, companies pivoted their supply chains to more responsible sources. And I think within solar and battery, we need that same thing to happen. And it's beginning to happen slowly, but really understanding, how long has your company been in business? How long will they be in business? And how exposed are they to market access are kind of the three broad categories that I would think about. And then, of course, there's is this investment going to do what I expected? Is it going to produce as much as I expected? Do I have a guarantee behind that production or a warranty or a insurance policy around the financials that have been represented?
All right. Totally agree. All right. So we talked about a lot of the structural issues of the industry. Now let's talk about financing a little bit and just, really two very broad categories. There's Section 25 of the tax credit, and that's what was canceled. That means that any residential customer gets an automatic 30% tax credit on any expenditures and installations that they get done by the end of this year. That's gone as of January 1st, 2026. The second category, which is still viable, is a commercial structure, which is used by leases and power purchase agreements. And those structures are still available to residential type installers, but they're selling under this commercial structure, and they're using a variety of techniques to make sure that they have safe harbor for their equipment. It reduces their cost. And then the other interesting thing is the solar tax credit is gone effectively even for commercial systems as of January 1st, but there's still a tax credit on batteries. So you're going to see companies using clever financing techniques that are going to preserve the tax credit for solar for a few years. And then the tax credit for batteries is good, I think, right through 2034 or something. So it's going to get a lot more complicated, but there's still going to be, I think, some of that viable financing, which makes so much sense for places where the electric rates may not be that high, where it may not be as sunny, and labor costs might be kind of on the high side. So give us a little perspective on what you think is going to happen with financing side of these installations.
Yeah, absolutely. You teed it up perfectly. There's two sides. The tax credits, 25D expires. That's the individual. And now 48E or 48Y are the business tax credits. And that really plays well into TPO providers. This is why you've seen Sunrun's stock really skyrocket. And a lot of the solar stocks skyrocketed after the executive order was released on Friday. A lot of the analysts are saying that, whereas today TPO is 50% market share, it's going to grow to something closer to 60 or 70% market share. And I fully agree with that. When we think about the residential segment across the US, we expect that it takes a step back from around 4 gigawatts in 25 down to probably 3 and change in 26. And, over 2 gigawatts, I think it's going to be closer to 2.5 of those gigawatts are going to be serviced by third-party ownership. What does that mean? I think there's going to be new entrants, right? So Sunrun has been the dominant player, but already you've seen companies like Goodleap, Lightreach, Everbright, and some other regional players begin to pop up on the East Coast. I think there will be more of that. Several of our customers are looking at kind of pursuing their own captive fund to create their own TPO products. And, there's transferability, which is, we were talking technical geeks stuff earlier. You can do the same thing on the finance side. I'm not nearly as qualified, but there is a mechanism now where you can use transferability with tax credits to create easier access to capital. So the first thing that's going to happen is I think there will be some more competition. The second thing is that there's going to be some innovation around financial products themselves. The one that I expect to happen the fastest, we're already hearing about it, is what we refer to as prepaid leases. I sold a lot of these when I was wearing my Sunrun hat. I'm sure you did as well. These are great products, right? They mirror a cash investment. And in essence, what's happening is the homeowner is basically deferring the tax credit to the corporation that owns the asset. And then there's different structures where after 5 years, title can transfer back to you with a buyout, or maybe you let the TPO own and maintain and warrant the system for 20 years. Up until now, that wasn't as popular because there's a kind of visceral emotion to taking a tax credit as a homeowner. I know I want one myself when I own my home. But now that that's off the table, I really expect to see an increase in prepaid options, some new innovations around prepaid options, and then, like I said, probably some new entrants on the TPO side. The last point I would make, the limiting factor here is going to be capital. And how much tax equity is there available? Is it going to be able to fund the growth from a 2 gigawatt market to a 2.5 gigawatt market? The OB3 actually is reducing the amount of tax equity, right? Because they passed tax cuts. And so that's one big concern that we're keeping an eye on. But in the financial markets, they've been saying for a couple of years, there's not enough tax equity to go around. And yet we've managed to deploy all the solar we've needed. So I'm less concerned about it, but I am watching it closely.
Yep. And then the third thing that we're looking at and probably going to use a lot more are credit union financing tools.
Yep.
This is a relatively low interest rate product. It's a credit union. It's basically a nonprofit banking structure, and that works really well. But that's going to be competing against what you mentioned, which is the prepaid lease. That you're not going to get a tax credit at all on the credit union, but with the prepaid lease, you will get that. But then when we kind of look at the overhead that's involved in doing leasing and prepaid leasing and PPAs, it's quite a bit more substantial in terms of documentation and payment delays than, a straightforward cash or credit union deal. So they'll both be really good. People are kind of scratching your heads. What are we going to start using in January? And I'm encouraging everybody to start thinking about that now. And especially when we go to RE Plus, I'm going to be talking to a lot of people about what those new financing tools are going to be.
So 100%, I think credit unions are a great option. We've seen like the dealer fee model where you're buying down, interest rates with a 35 or 40% dealer fee. Those are gone, hopefully. And so I think credit unions are a great backstop. Another point I think is you have to make while we're talking about financing is the impact it's going to have on overall supply. And so we mentioned FIOC at the top. This is a confusing, really opaque topic that hasn't had definition yet. However, oftentimes capital markets are the first ones to begin to move around these sort of policies. And so we're already seeing some equity providers call out that they will not work with particular suppliers because of their FIOC exposure. So as you begin thinking about expanding your business or moving into a TPO solution, make sure that your supply chain is aligned with their AVL, right? And make sure that you have access to the products that they have on their AVL, because that will be more limited. And then I think you hit the nail on the head. Be prepared for sales friction, or at least deal processing friction, because it is more cumbersome.
Yep, yeah. All right. Any other general advice for either solar homeowners or commercial customers looking for solar, or contractors that we might not have covered yet?
I see a lot of folks head down, focusing on the end of the year as they should. I think we got to, the best we can, put our heads up and start looking down the field. And, I've done a couple of these interviews, a couple of magazine articles. The one thing I'll mention is we've got really bright, really, really motivated people in this industry. So I would, table any despair, know that we've got problems to solve. And at the end of the day, we're going to solve them. And that's going to make us a stronger, more resilient industry. When I started out with REC, they were owned by a parent company called Mainstream Energy. And Mainstream's vision was that solar would one day become mainstream, right? Well, I think we're actually really, really close to that. We're kind of putting the first chapter of a nascent industry behind us. And as we can get the incentive structures, sunset, that ultimately makes it more durable. So I think put your head down, work as hard as you can to get through the next 18 months, and then we've got green fields ahead.
Yeah, and that ties right into the good news that we're all experiencing is the electric rates will keep going up. Demand for AI is going to increase the demand for electricity, and that's going to be fulfilled by utilities at really high rates. Once again, that's why rates will go up. And the costs for solar and battery systems, without a doubt, are going to continue to go down, simply because we're mass producing those machines, those devices that produce electrons and kilowatt hours with storage. So that's cool. All right, so let's kind of back up a little bit, back up to before 2008. What prompted you to get into this crazy solar business?
Man, if I had a time machine, I don't know that I would make the same decision. I'm kidding. So I graduated college in the early 2000s. Didn't know what I wanted to do. Was working in commercial real estate at the time. I had a friend that got involved in solar, and I thought, man, that's really cool. Aligned with kind of my values and what I wanted to put my professional effort in, which is combating climate change. And it also, was ground floor. The funny thing is, when I started, this was '08. In '06 and '07, I did a lot of diligence about starting my own company. And I surmised incorrectly at the time that I was too late, that there was too many big companies. And so I was going to go get a job with one of the national companies. So that ultimately was what led me into the industry. The story of my beginning was I banged on REC's door until they hired me to answer the phones, and then moved into sales management. We were bought by Sunrun. I did the IPO, ran with them for 10 years, and came over to REC Group in 19. But high level, it's, being involved in energy is incredibly exciting. Being involved in something that can align with your values, I think, also helps you wake up excited for work every day. And then, there's a lot of, like I mentioned at the top, really energetic, intelligent, motivated people that are attracted to the industry. And as soon as I got involved, that's what kept me around. Despite all of the, I call it brain damage, it's the people that make it fun and keep you going.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this for so long. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I got challenges, but I know that we're doing the right thing for the environment. We're making progress. There's always bumps in the road. There's always the dips in the solar coaster, but we know we're going to prevail in a very big way in the future. All right. I know you have fun in the solar industry, but specifically, what kind of non-solar fun do you have? What do you do for enjoyment, recreation?
So I live on the Central Coast, San Luis Obispo. We do a lot of outdoor activities. I have two young children, well, young, they're 11 and 13 now. We're a big basketball family. I love basketball. Had I been 3 inches taller and maybe more athletic, I would have tried to make a career doing that, but wasn't able to. So they are now big basketball players. I coach and officiate and inspire is what we call it with the children, sometimes loudly. So if I'm not talking about solar, I'm either out hiking in San Luis Obispo, or I'm coaching basketball with my kids.
Wow, that sounds really, really cool. Okay. Well, this was a great discussion. We covered a lot of different bases, so to speak, but how can people get in touch with REC if they're interested in opportunities, interested in products, or interested in some of the things you said?
Yeah, always check our website first, recgroup.com. If you fill out a lead form, we'll get you in touch with one of our regional sales managers. So I'm head of sales. We have 8 regional sales managers across the country. And we really do try and take it a step beyond just being a manufacturer. And we try and help out with all aspects of running a solar business. So that's probably the best way. Another way is to get in touch with your local distributor. We work closely with Green Tech, Sonopar, as well as several others. So if you have a distributor that you prefer, ask about our product, and then pretty quickly you'll be able to get in touch with one of our local managers. And then I'll share with you all of our roster, and you can share it with folks that reach out.
That's perfect. Okay. Well, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Thanks, Brian, for joining us. Terrific discussions. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you missed any of today's show, you can always go to our website at www.energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's Energy Show.